The $600 leather shoe connected with Lorena's ribs before she even saw it coming. She crashed backward into the frosted display window of a boutique, her body hitting the cold glass as it shattered around her. Her arms scraped against the metal edge of a marble bench. Warm blood pooled against her skin. For a moment, the entire Anchorage mall froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A child's laughter died. Phones rose into the air like weapons, already recording. Lorena looked up from the floor at the man standing over her, his face twisted with contempt. Clifford Fortney. Stay down where you belong, you worthless nothing, he snarled, his voice loud enough for the entire corridor to hear. I knew you'd come crawling back. Poor. Desperate. Still nothing. He kicked her again. Once. Hard. Her body slid across the polished floor. What Cliff believed in that moment was simple. He believed she was exactly what he remembered. Broken. Begging. Still powerless. He believed the version of her story he'd told everyone years ago was still true. He believed he was untouchable. He believed Lorena Kennedy was nothing. He had no idea who she was anymore. No idea that the woman trembling on the floor, the one who'd left Alaska 3 years ago with nothing, the one he destroyed and left to starve, had risen from those ashes. No idea about the platinum wedding ring hidden under her coat sleeve. No idea about the penthouse in Anchorage's most exclusive district she'd left that morning. No idea about the black credit card in her purse with no limit and a name that made grown men nervous. And Cliff definitely had no idea about the man whose name was legally attached to hers. The man who'd been watching from exactly 40 feet away. The man whose security team was now physically restraining him. The man whose phone was ringing in Lorena's purse right now. Marco Browning. Alaska's most dangerous underground king. The man whose influence ran through the state like a silent current beneath frozen water. As Lorena's trembling fingers accepted the call and Marco's deadly calm voice asked, "Are you hurt?" she watched realization start to creep across Cliff's face. He just kicked the wrong woman. And in approximately 12 minutes, when Marco's motorcade pulled into this mall's private entrance, Clifford Fortney was going to learn a lesson about consequences that would destroy everything he thought he owned. But he still didn't know it yet. Right now, in this moment, he still believed she was nothing. That was about to change. If you think you know how this story ends, you're wrong. Because what happens next will destroy everything Cliff believes he knows about power. And it all starts with a woman who finally decided to speak. But before we go deeper into Lorena's journey, hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications so you don't miss a single moment. Lorena stood in front of the mirror of their penthouse, selecting a simple black dress. Despite the luxury surrounding her, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Anchorage, a closet filled with pieces most women would never own, a life most women would only dream of. She still gravitated toward understated elegance. Old habits from harder times die slowly. You're doing it again, Marco said from the doorway, already dressed in a dark charcoal suit that probably cost more than her first month's rent had been, years ago. He was dangerously handsome, sharp features, dark eyes that missed nothing, a presence that commanded attention even in the quiet intimacy of their bedroom. Doing what? She clipped on pearl earrings, simple and pale against her skin. Choosing the least expensive things in your closet. Hiding, even when you don't have to hide anymore. She turned to face him. He crossed to her slowly, sliding his hands around her waist with the kind of careful gentleness that always caught her off guard. For a man like Marco, for a man who controlled empires, he was surprisingly tender with her. I like simple things, she said softly. They make me feel like myself. You are yourself, he said, his voice steady. That's why I married you. Not because of money. Not because of what I could give you. Because you survived something that should have broken you, and you still chose kindness. He kissed her forehead. But Lorena, you don't have to be invisible anymore. She pulled back slightly, meeting his eyes. I'm not invisible. Not to you. No, he said. But you're about to go back to a place where people still see you that way. Where he still sees you that way. Are you sure about this visit? She didn't answer immediately. The truth was, she wasn't sure. She was terrified. But some things needed to be faced. 3 years earlier, Lorena worked the morning shift at a dental office, the afternoon shift at a boutique, and the evening shift cleaning office buildings after midnight. Her hands were always raw. Her back always ached. But the bills got paid, and that was enough. Cliff, meanwhile, was becoming someone. He networked at bars she couldn't afford. He bought suits on credit and talked about investments he didn't understand. He told her ambition required sacrifice, and she believed him. She sacrificed. She cleaned toilets at 2 a.m. so he could have lunch with people who might matter someday. I'm going to be somebody, he'd say, lounging on their apartment couch while she ironed his shirts. And when I am, you'll be glad you stuck with me. She was glad. She was always glad. Gladness was the only thing she had left to give. But somewhere between her third job and his fourth business card, something shifted. Cliff stopped coming home at reasonable hours. He stopped thanking her. He stopped seeing her at all. She became background noise, a convenience that had outlived its usefulness. When she asked where he was, he told her she was suffocating him. When she asked about their future, he said she was too needy to understand ambition. The financial drain started slowly. A loan to a friend he'd never mentioned. An investment opportunity that required their savings. A business venture that needed her inheritance. Each time she hesitated, he made her feel small for not believing in him. Each time she gave, he made her feel foolish for asking questions. By the time she realized what was happening, there was nothing left. No savings. No inheritance. No safety net. Then came the day he told her he was leaving. You're holding me back, he said, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. I need someone who understands my vision. Someone ambitious. You're just tired all the time. She tried to explain that she was tired because she was drowning. He wasn't listening. Within days, he'd rewritten the entire story. He told their mutual friends that she was unstable, that she'd sabotaged his career out of jealousy, that she was needy and desperate. He made himself the victim of her inability to support his dreams. People believed him. People always believed him. Lorena left Alaska 3 months later with $47 in her pocket and the crushing certainty that she had failed at the only thing that mattered, being enough for someone. She didn't know yet that she was actually escaping. She only knew that she was broken, and that Alaska was a place where everyone knew it. She swore she would never come back. She swore she would never be that woman again. She disappeared into a city where no one knew her name. Portland. Seattle. Denver. The names blur together now, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that she became someone who didn't exist. Lorena rented a studio apartment in a neighborhood where landlords didn't ask questions. She worked in warehouses, restaurants, retail stores, places where employees were interchangeable, forgettable. She was good at being forgettable. She'd had practice. The silence started as survival and became a way of life. She didn't call old friends. She didn't update her social media. She didn't tell anyone where she was or who she'd become. Every connection to her old self felt dangerous, like a thread that could unravel and pull her backward into the woman Cliff had convinced everyone she was. So she cut the threads. All of them. Back in Anchorage, Cliff's version of events had calcified into truth. He was the ambitious man derailed by an unstable woman. He was the victim. Lorena's silence, her refusal to defend herself, to explain, to fight back, confirmed every lie he'd told. Her absence became proof of her guilt. If she wasn't broken, where was she? Why wasn't she defending her name? She was learning that silence has a cost. It protected her from scrutiny, yes. But it also meant that no one knew the real story. No one knew about the loans that were never repaid. No one knew about the savings that had vanished. No one knew about the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to fund another person's dream only to be discarded when she became inconvenient. Her silence let Cliff win. But more than that, it let her survive. In those years of obscurity, Lorena built something small and quiet and entirely her own. She saved money in a bank account no one knew about. She read books about finance and business and the psychology of manipulation. She went to therapy with a therapist who never once judged her for staying so long, for giving so much, for believing so completely in a man who was teaching her the opposite of love. Slowly, she stopped seeing herself through Cliff's eyes. The woman who looked back at her in the mirror wasn't broken. She was resilient. She wasn't weak. She was intelligent enough to admit she'd been fooled, and brave enough to start over. But the silence remained. It had become her default, her armor, her way of moving through the world. Speaking up meant risk. Speaking up meant being heard, and being heard meant being vulnerable. Vulnerability was what had destroyed her before. So she stayed quiet. She stayed invisible. She stayed safe. She didn't know yet that safety and freedom are not the same thing. She didn't know that silence, taken too far, becomes its own kind of prison. She only knew that as long as no one saw her, no one could hurt her. It was a good strategy for survival. It was a terrible strategy for living. She met Marco at a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. He was reading a book about chess strategy, and she was reading one about financial independence. They reached for the same sugar packet and smiled at each other, the kind of smile that could have meant nothing. It meant everything. He didn't ask her questions. This was the thing that made her trust him. He didn't ask why she was alone. He didn't ask where she was from or what had happened to her or why she sometimes flinched when people raised their voices. He simply sat across from her, day after day, existing in the same space without demanding anything. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," he said one afternoon, 3 weeks in. "I'm not interested in your past. I'm interested in who you are now." No one had ever said that to her before. Their relationship grew in silence, which felt like kindness. He would text her simple things, "Found a good restaurant. Want to try it?" Or reading about Alaskan wildlife. "Thought of you." He never pushed. He never probed. He simply showed up, consistently, predictably, safely. Months passed. She learned that he traveled frequently, always on business he never fully explained. She learned that certain phone calls made him leave the room, his voice dropping to something she couldn't quite hear. She learned that he knew people. Important people, dangerous people, by the way conversations would stop when he entered a room. But he was never violent with her. Never controlling. Never demanding. He respected her silences the way she respected his secrets. "What do you do?" she finally asked him, 6 months in. "Business," he said simply. "Nothing you need to worry about." She didn't ask again. Some part of her already knew. Some part of her had always known. But knowing and speaking were 2 different things, and she had learned the power of not speaking. When he proposed, he did it in their apartment, no fanfare, no audience. Just a ring and a question, "Will you marry me?" She said yes without telling him about Cliff. Without telling him about the loans, the betrayal, the 3 years of disappearing. Without telling him about the woman she used to be. "I have a past," she said instead. "I'm not proud of all of it." "Everyone has a past," Marco replied. "I'm marrying the woman in front of me, not the one behind you." She married him believing he didn't know. She married him believing she could keep that part of herself hidden forever. She married him believing that silence could protect them both. What she didn't understand was that Marco knew more than she realized. What she didn't understand was that he was waiting. Waiting for her to be ready. Waiting for her to trust him enough to speak. What she didn't understand was that their marriage wasn't built on her silence. It was built on his patience. I need to go back, Lorena said one evening, standing at their penthouse window overlooking Anchorage. She hadn't planned to say it. The words simply escaped, like a breath she'd been holding for years. Marco was quiet. He was always quiet when something mattered. Why? He finally asked. Because I left like a ghost. I need to know if I can exist there without disappearing again. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't offer to come with her or promise to handle whatever she was afraid of. He simply nodded and said, "How long?" "A week. Maybe 10 days. Alone?" "Yes." He crossed to her and took her hand. His grip was firm but not demanding. "If you need me, call. I'll be here in 4 hours." That was all he said. No warnings. No lectures about caution. Just the quiet certainty that he would move mountains if she asked. But she didn't ask him to come. She needed to do this alone. She needed to prove to herself that the woman she'd become was stronger than the woman she'd been. She booked a hotel under Marco's name, a habit born from caution, a protection she hadn't fully examined. She told no one she was coming. She wanted to move through Anchorage like a ghost, the way she'd left it. In and out. Invisible. For the first 3 days, she was successful. She walked the neighborhoods where she'd once worked. She saw the dental office where she'd scrubbed teeth for 12-hour shifts. She saw the boutique where she'd folded clothes while Cliff chased status. None of it hurt as much as she'd expected. The past felt like something that had happened to someone else. She was beginning to believe she could do this. On the 4th day, she went to the mall. It was mid-afternoon. The crowds were thin. She was browsing a high-end boutique, running her fingers across fabrics she could now afford but still didn't want, when she felt it. That particular quality of attention that comes from being recognized by someone you've spent years forgetting. She turned slowly. Cliff stood 20 feet away, shopping with a woman Lorena didn't recognize. He looked older, softer around the edges, less polished than she remembered. Less threatening. But his eyes, when they locked onto hers, held the same certainty they always had. The certainty of a man who believed the world arranged itself around his desires. His face shifted. Confusion first. Then recognition. Then something darker. A smile that looked like a predator remembering prey. He nudged his companion and started walking toward her. Lorena's instinct was to run. To disappear. To become invisible again. But she didn't move. She stood perfectly still and watched him approach, her phone heavy in her pocket, Marco's number just 1 call away. She had no idea that everything was about to change. Well, Cliff said, his voice carrying across the boutique like he was performing for an audience. "Lorena Kennedy. I heard you were dead." She didn't respond. Silence had always been her shield, and she wrapped it around herself now. "Cat got your tongue?" He laughed, that same laugh that used to make her feel small. "Still the same broken thing, I see. Still can't even speak for yourself." His companion looked uncomfortable, but she stayed beside him. Loyalty or complicity, Lorena couldn't tell the difference anymore. "You know what the funny part is?" Cliff stepped closer, his voice rising. "People were starting to look. You left here like you were better than everyone. Like you had some grand plan. But here you are, alone in a mall on a Tuesday afternoon, shopping in the clearance section. Some things never change, do they?" Lorena's heart was hammering. Her palms were sweating. The old panic was clawing at her throat, begging her to run, to hide, to disappear. But she forced herself to breathe. To stay. To watch. "Actually, I think you owe me an apology," Cliff continued, his voice taking on that cruel edge she remembered. The edge that came right before he did something he'd later claim she'd provoked. "For wasting my time. For holding me back. For being so pathetic that I had to leave." He reached out and shoved her shoulder, hard enough to make her stumble backward into a display of scarves. They cascaded around her like snow. The boutique had gone quiet. Every person in the store was watching now. "Don't touch me," Lorena said quietly. Her voice was so soft that Cliff almost didn't hear it. But he did. And something in her tone, something that wasn't begging, wasn't pleading, made him angrier. "What?" he snarled. "You think you can talk to me like that? You think you're somebody now?" He grabbed her arm. She pulled away. He pushed her backward, and she stumbled, catching herself against the edge of a marble bench. When she looked up, she saw his foot rising. The kick connected with her ribs. The pain was sharp and bright. She fell to the floor, her body sliding across the polished marble, her arms scraping against the bench's metal edge. Warm blood dripped down her skin. For a moment, the entire mall seemed to hold its breath. Then phones rose into the air. Dozens of them. Recording. Capturing. Witnessing. Cliff stood over her, breathing hard, his face flushed with the adrenaline of violence. "That's what you get for coming back here," he spat. "For thinking you could just waltz back into my city like you matter." He turned and walked away, his companion hurrying after him, already trying to explain, to minimize, to reframe what had just happened. Lorena lay on the floor, bleeding and gasping, watching him leave. And in that moment, she realized something that would change everything. Cliff had just given her a gift. He'd exposed himself completely. In front of witnesses. In front of cameras. In front of a city that was about to see exactly who he was. She pulled out her phone with a shaking hand and called Marco. "I'm hurt," she whispered. "And I'm ready." By evening, the video had spread across every social media platform in Alaska. Not the full version, the one that showed Cliff's unprovoked violence. Instead, edited clips circulated showing Lorena on the floor, making her look hysterical. Captions read, "Woman attacks man in mall and unhinged ex tries to sabotage successful businessmen." The narrative was already being rewritten. Cliff moved fast. Within hours, he'd posted his own version. He claimed she'd confronted him aggressively, that he'd only defended himself, that her appearance at the mall proved she was stalking him. He painted himself as the victim of an obsessed woman who couldn't accept that he'd moved on. Comments poured in from people who believed him, people who'd known the old Cliff, who'd heard his version of their relationship years ago, who saw a man defending himself against a crazy ex. Lorena watched it all from their penthouse, numb. The familiar pattern was repeating. The lie was winning. Her silence was being interpreted as guilt. Marco sat beside her, his phone buzzing constantly. Calls. Messages. Updates from people she didn't know, reporting back on what was happening in the city below. "I can end this," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, a current of controlled power that made it clear he wasn't speaking metaphorically. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean I can make sure he disappears. Financially. Professionally. Physically, if you want. I can erase him from Alaska like he never existed. One phone call." The offer hung between them, heavy and real. "How?" she asked. "Better you don't know the details." She understood what he was offering. Justice delivered through violence and fear and the kind of power that operated in shadows. The kind of power that had made her fall in love with him in the first place, not because he was dangerous, but because he was completely, unapologetically in control. "If you do that," she said slowly, "then his version wins. Then the story becomes about him being destroyed by a man with power, not about him being exposed for who he is." Marco was quiet. "And people will assume I asked you to do it. They'll say I hid behind you. They'll say a mafia boss's wife took revenge instead of facing him herself. Does that matter?" Marco asked. "What people think?" "Yes," Lorena said, and she was surprised by her own certainty. "It does. Because the story isn't about Cliff anymore. It's about me." About whether I'm still the woman who disappears, or whether I'm someone who stands. Marco studied her face. What do you want, then? She didn't answer immediately. The truth was, she didn't know. She wanted justice. She wanted vindication. She wanted Cliff to suffer the way she'd suffered. But she also wanted something more dangerous than any of that. She wanted her voice back. I need time, she finally said. Marco nodded. He didn't push. He simply pulled her close and held her while the lies continued to spread, while the city below continued to believe a version of events that wasn't true, while she sat in the silence of her own uncertainty. For the first time in years, the choice was entirely hers. Are you sitting with Lorena in this moment? Do you understand the weight of this choice? Because in the comments below, I know there are women who've faced this exact decision. Power offered to them, and they had to choose their integrity instead. Share your story. Tell me in the comments, what would you have chosen? Your voice matters. Comment now. And she had no idea what she would do with it. 3 days passed. 3 days of watching the narrative solidify into false truth. 3 days of Cliff's version spreading while her silence confirmed every lie he'd told. On the 4th morning, Lorena made a decision. I'm going to speak, she told Marco. But I need to do this myself. No power plays. No threats. Just the truth. Marco didn't argue. He simply began making calls, quiet, methodical calls to people she'd never met, people who existed in the margins of his world. Investigators. Accountants. People who knew how to find things that others wanted to stay hidden. Within 48 hours, they had everything. Financial records showing how Cliff had systematically drained her savings. Bank transfers marked with her signature, forged or coerced. Emails where he discussed using her money for business ventures that never materialized. A pattern so clear, so deliberate, that it became impossible to deny. But records alone wouldn't be enough. Lorena knew that. She needed voices. She needed other women. She started with the most obvious one, a woman named Sarah who dated Cliff before her. Sarah had disappeared from Anchorage the same way Lorena had, though their paths had never crossed. When Lorena found her in Seattle, working quietly in a nonprofit, Sarah's hands shook as she listened to Lorena's story. He did the same thing to me, Sarah whispered. Different details, same pattern. I thought I was the only one. Then came Jennifer. Then Michelle. Then 4 more women Lorena found through careful research and careful listening. Women who'd been silenced by shame, by disbelief, by the simple fact that a lie told loudly enough becomes indistinguishable from truth. Each woman had a story. Each story was slightly different. But the architecture was identical. Cliff targeted women with resources or potential. He positioned himself as their partner, their champion. He slowly extracted everything, money, confidence, dignity. When they became inconvenient, he discarded them and rewritten the narrative so thoroughly that they questioned their own memories. Lorena sat with each woman. She didn't ask them to be brave. She didn't ask them to relive their trauma publicly. She simply asked them to tell her the truth, and if they wanted, to let that truth be documented. Most of them said yes. As the evidence accumulated, Lorena felt something shifting inside her. The old instinct to hide was still there, whispering that speaking would make her vulnerable, that silence was safer. But underneath that whisper was a newer, stronger voice. The voice of a woman who'd survived worse than judgment. Who'd already lost everything and had somehow rebuilt it anyway. She thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd worked 3 jobs and asked no questions and believed that her sacrifice was love. She thought about the woman Cliff had convinced everyone she was. Broken, unstable, desperate. And she thought about who she was now. A woman with choices. A woman with agency. A woman ready to reclaim the narrative that had been stolen from her. She opened her laptop and began to write. Not an angry manifesto. Not a cry for revenge. Simply the truth, told clearly and without apology. By the time she finished, the sun was rising over Anchorage. She was ready. Lorena released the first statement on a Wednesday morning. Not a social media post. Not a dramatic video. A carefully written document posted to a personal blog, shared directly with journalists, sent to every person who'd amplified Cliff's lies. The truth, presented methodically. Dates. Bank records. Emails. Screenshots of conversations where Cliff had discussed his strategy for extracting money from her. Her words were calm, factual, devastating. Within hours, the journalists started calling. Within a day, the first articles appeared. Not sensationalized. Not dramatized. Just the documented evidence of systematic financial and emotional abuse. Cliff's allies began disappearing. His business partners stopped returning his calls. The woman he'd been with at the mall released a statement saying she'd ended their relationship immediately after the incident, that she couldn't be associated with someone capable of such violence. His social media accounts filled with comments from people he thought were loyal, now revealing their own stories of manipulation and deceit. His reputation didn't collapse gradually. It imploded. By Friday, Lorena released the second statement. This one included the other women. Sarah. Jennifer. Michelle. And the 4 others. Not their full names, they didn't want that, but their stories, their voices, their corroborating evidence that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. This was predatory. The city that had believed Cliff's version began to see him clearly for the first time. Then came the moment that changed everything. Cliff showed up at the penthouse building. Security turned him away twice. The third time, he forced his way past the concierge, desperate and unraveling. When Marco's security team intercepted him in the lobby, he was already breaking down. Tell her to take it back, he screamed. Tell her to take it all back. She's ruining me. She's destroying everything. That's when Marco walked out of the elevator. Cliff's face went white. Not because Marco was physically intimidating, though he was. But because in that moment, he understood. He understood who Lorena was married to. He understood the reach of the power he'd been unknowingly antagonizing. You, Cliff whispered. You're the man who's been watching you destroy my wife's reputation while deciding how patient to be, Marco said quietly. The man who's been waiting for her to decide what she wanted instead of taking matters into his own hands. The man who just learned that patience was the right choice. Cliff was removed from the building by security. But not before Lorena came downstairs. She stood before him, and for the first time since she'd known him, she didn't look afraid. She looked certain. You spent years telling people I was nothing, she said. Her voice was steady, clear, unmistakably hers. You told them I was broken. You told them I was powerless. But none of that was true. The only thing that was true was my silence. And I'm done being silent. Cliff tried to speak, to defend himself, to rewrite the narrative one more time. You don't own my story anymore, Lorena continued. You never did. I do. She turned and walked back toward the elevator, Marco beside her, no longer waiting. For the first time, Cliff had no words. 6 weeks later, Lorena stood in front of a room full of journalists, survivors, and community leaders in downtown Anchorage. The press conference was being live-streamed. Thousands were watching. She didn't hide behind notes or careful language. She spoke about what it meant to be systematically drained, financially, emotionally, spiritually. She talked about the shame that kept her silent. She talked about the years of disappearing, believing that invisibility was the same as safety. She talked about the man who'd convinced her she was nothing, and how long it took to remember that she was everything. Financial abuse is a form of control, she said, her voice steady and clear. It's designed to make you dependent. To make you question your own worth. To silence you. I was silenced for 3 years. I let someone else own my story. I won't do that anymore. And I'm launching this foundation so that other women don't have to either. The Lorena Kennedy Foundation for Women's Financial Independence opened 2 months later in a renovated building in Midtown Anchorage. Its mission was simple: to provide legal support, financial literacy, and community for women experiencing or recovering from financial abuse. Marco attended the opening. He stood in the back of the room, watching Lorena move through the crowd with a confidence that hadn't existed before. When she caught his eye, she smiled. Not the grateful smile of someone being rescued, but the knowing smile of a partner recognizing another partner. He was no longer her shield. He was her witness. 3 months after that, Lorena returned to the mall. She walked through the same corridor where Cliff had kicked her. The boutique where it happened had changed ownership. New displays. New staff. But the marble floor was the same. The space was the same. She stood there for a moment, remembering. Not the pain. Though that had been real. But the moment after, when she'd made a choice. When she decided that her silence was her own, and she was done giving it away. A woman approached her, someone she didn't recognize. "You're Lorena Kennedy, aren't you?" the woman asked. "I wanted to thank you. Your story helped me leave my situation. I'm starting over." Lorena embraced her without hesitation. This is the moment Lorena Kennedy stopped being invisible. This is the moment she became fully seen, fully free, and fully hers. And if this story has moved you, if you felt even a fraction of her journey, then subscribe now. Join thousands of viewers who are watching real women reclaim their narratives. Because stories like this deserve to be heard. That night, she sat with Marco on their penthouse balcony, overlooking the city lights of Anchorage spread out below them like promises kept. "Do you regret coming back?" Marco asked. "No," Lorena said. "Coming back broke me open. But that's not the same as breaking me. I needed to be broken open to rebuild myself. And now? Now I'm not invisible anymore. Not to this city. Not to myself. Not to you." Marco took her hand. Not possessively. Not protectively. Simply as an equal holding hands with another equal. Lorena Kennedy was no longer the woman who disappeared. She was no longer the woman Cliff had convinced everyone she was. She was the woman who'd chosen her own story. Who'd reclaimed her voice. Who'd transformed her pain into purpose. She was fully seen. She was fully free. And the silence that had once saved her had finally learned to speak.